Accomplishment of the promise made to the dead woman. Chapter 1. The water question at Montfermeil. Montfermeil is situated between Livry and Chelles, on the southern edge of that lofty tableland which separates the Ourcq from the Marne. At the present day it is a tolerably large town, ornamented all the year through with plaster villas, and on Sundays with beaming bourgeois. In 1823 there were at Montfermeil neither so many white houses nor so many well-satisfied citizens. It was only a village in the forest. Some pleasure houses of the last century were to be met with there. To be sure, which were recognizable by their grand air, their balconies in twisted iron, and their long windows, whose tiny panes cast all sorts of varying shades of green on the white of the closed shutters. But Montfermeil was nonetheless a village. Retired cloth merchants and rusticating attorneys had not discovered it as yet. It was a peaceful and charming place, which was not on the road to anywhere. There people lived, and cheaply, that peasant rustic life which is so bounteous and so easy. Only, water was rare there, on account of the elevation of the plateau. It was necessary to fetch it from a considerable distance. The end of the village towards Gagny drew its water from the magnificent ponds which exist in the woods there. The other end, which surrounds the church and which lies in the direction of Chelles, found drinking water only at a little spring halfway down the slope, near the road to Chelles, about a quarter of an hour from Montfermeil. Thus each household found it hard work to keep supplied with water. The large houses, the aristocracy, of which the Thénardier tavern formed a part, paid half a farthing a bucketful to a man who made a business of it, and who earned about 8 sous a day in his enterprise of supplying Montfermeil with water. But this good man only worked until 7 o'clock in the evening in summer, and 5 in winter. And night once come and the shutters on the ground floor once closed, he who had no water to drink went to fetch it for himself or did without it. This constituted the terror of the poor creature whom the reader has probably not forgotten, little Cosette. It will be remembered that Cosette was useful to the Thénardiers in 2 ways. They made the mother pay them, and they made the child serve them. So when the mother ceased to pay altogether, the reason for which we have read in preceding chapters, the Thénardiers kept Cosette. She took the place of a servant in their house. In this capacity it was who ran to fetch water when it was required. So the child, who was greatly terrified at the idea of going to the spring at night, took great care that water should never be lacking in the house. Christmas of the year 1823 was particularly brilliant at Montfermeil. The beginning of the winter had been mild. There had been neither snow nor frost up to that time. Some mountebanks from Paris had obtained permission of the mayor to erect their booths in the principal street of the village. And a band of itinerant merchants, under protection of the same tolerance, had constructed their stalls on the church square, and even extended them into Boulanger Alley, where, as the reader will perhaps remember, the Thénardiers' hostelry was situated. These people filled the inns and drinking shops, and communicated to that tranquil little district a noisy and joyous life. In order to play the part of a faithful historian, we ought even to add that, among the curiosities displayed in the square, there was a menagerie, in which frightful clowns, clad in rags and coming no one knew whence, exhibited to the peasants of Montfermeil in 1823 one of those horrible Brazilian vultures, such as our Royal Museum did not possess until 1845, and which have a tricolored cockade for an eye. I believe that naturalists call this bird Caracara polyborus. It belongs to the order of the apicides, and to the family of the vultures. Some good old Bonapartist soldiers, who had retired to the village, went to see this creature with great devotion. The mountebanks gave out that the tricolored cockade was a unique phenomenon made by God expressly for their menagerie. On Christmas Eve itself, a number of men, carters, and peddlers, were seated at table, drinking and smoking around 4 or 5 candles in the public room of Thénardier's hostelry. This room resembled all drinking shop rooms: tables, pewter jugs, bottles, drinkers, smokers. But little light and a great deal of noise. The date of the year 1823 was indicated, nevertheless, by 2 objects which were then fashionable in the bourgeois class. To wit, a kaleidoscope and a lamp of ribbed tin. The female Thénardier was attending to the supper, which was roasting in front of a clear fire. Her husband was drinking with his customers and talking politics. Besides political conversations which had for their principal subjects the Spanish War and Le Duc d'Angoulême, strictly local parentheses, like the following, were audible amid the uproar. About Nanterre and Suresnes the vines have flourished greatly. When 10 pieces were reckoned on, there have been 12. They have yielded a great deal of juice under the press. But the grapes cannot be ripe. In those parts the grapes should not be ripe. The wine turns oily as soon as spring comes. Then it is very thin wine. There are wines poorer even than these. The grapes must be gathered while green, etc. Or a miller would call out, "Are we responsible for what is in the sacks? We find in them a quantity of small seed which we cannot sift out, and which we are obliged to send through the millstones. There are tares, fennel, vetches, hempseed, foxtail, and a host of other weeds, not to mention pebbles, which abound in certain wheat, especially in Breton wheat. I am not fond of grinding Breton wheat, any more than long sawyers like to saw beams with nails in them. You can judge of the bad dust that makes in grinding. And then people complain of the flour. They are in the wrong. The flour is no fault of ours." In a space between 2 windows a mower, who was seated at table with a landed proprietor who was fixing on a price for some meadow work to be performed in the spring, was saying, "It does no harm to have the grass wet. It cuts better. Dew is a good thing, sir. It makes no difference with that grass. Your grass is young and very hard to cut still. It's terribly tender. It yields before the iron," etc. Cosette was in her usual place, seated on the crossbar of the kitchen table near the chimney. She was in rags. Her bare feet were thrust into wooden shoes, and by the firelight she was engaged in knitting woolen stockings destined for the young Thénardiers. A very young kitten was playing about among the chairs. Laughter and chatter were audible in the adjoining room, from 2 fresh children's voices. It was Éponine and Azelma. In the chimney corner a cat o' 9 tails was hanging on a nail. At intervals the cry of a very young child, which was somewhere in the house, rang through the noise of the dram shop. It was a little boy who had been born to the Thénardiers during one of the preceding winters. She did not know why, she said, the result of the cold, and who was a little more than 3 years old. The mother had nursed him, but she did not love him. When the persistent clamor of the brat became too annoying, "Your son is squalling," Thénardier would say,
"Do go and see what he wants." "Bah," the mother would reply, "he bothers me." And the neglected child continued to shriek in the dark.